He held up my glass like it was evidence in a trial.
I'm not marrying a man who can't even afford real champagne.
6 weeks earlier, I had signed the paper that made me the majority owner of the company Rick worked for. Nobody in that room knew that. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and for most of my life I was invisible on purpose. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, in a house with thin walls and a furnace that only worked if you hit it in the right spot. My father drove a delivery truck for 26 years. My mother cleaned offices downtown before the sun came up. We were not poor in the way people mean when they want sympathy. We were poor in the ordinary way, the kind where you learn to stretch a pound of ground beef across 4 dinners and you do not ask for a second pair of shoes. My grandmother, Ruth, lived 2 streets over, and she was the one who raised me in the hours my parents were working. She used to say, "The quietest man in the room is usually the one who owns it." I did not understand that sentence until I was almost 40 years old. I was not a genius in school. I was not the kid who got noticed. I got decent grades, I played a little baseball, and I worked a paper route until I was old enough to bag groceries. What I had, instead of talent, was a stubborn habit of paying attention. I noticed which stores were always busy and which were always empty. I noticed which buildings sat vacant for years and which ones somebody eventually bought quietly and fixed up. I noticed that the people who ended up with money were rarely the loudest people in the room. After high school, I did not go to a 4-year college. I could not afford it, and I did not want the debt. I went to a community college 2 towns over and studied business part-time while working full-time at a hardware store. It took me almost 5 years to finish a 2-year degree, but I finished it without owing anyone a dollar. At 23, I bought my first property. It was a duplex on the edge of town that nobody wanted, with a roof that leaked and a foundation that needed work. I used every dollar I had saved since I was 14, plus a small loan my grandmother co-signed for me, against my parents' wishes. I fixed the place up myself on weekends, learned plumbing from videos and trial and error, and rented both units within 4 months. That duplex became a 4-plex. The 4-plex became a small apartment building. By the time I was 30, I owned 11 properties across 3 counties, and I had started a small holding company under a name that meant nothing to anyone outside of filing paperwork. I never put my name on a building. I never gave interviews. I paid my taxes. I paid my contractors fairly and on time, and I let the properties speak for themselves. My grandmother used to say a second thing to me, one I held on to even harder than the first. She said, "Let people underestimate you, Daniel. It is the cheapest advantage you will ever get, and nobody can take it from you unless you hand it to them yourself." I met my wife Ashley when I was 32. She was working the front desk at a property management conference in Columbus, the kind of event I only went to because a contractor friend of mine was speaking on a panel. Ashley was sharp, funny, and she had a way of making you feel like the only person in a crowded room. She did not know I owned anything. To her, I was just a guy in a slightly wrinkled blazer who asked good questions and did not talk about himself much. I liked that she did not know. I liked that for the first time in years, someone was interested in me and not in what I had. We dated for a year and a half. I never lied to her, not once, but I also never volunteered the full truth. When she asked what I did, I told her I worked in real estate, which was accurate and vague in equal measure. When she asked if I did well, I told her I did fine, which was also true, in the same way that saying the ocean is wet is true. I told myself I would tell her everything once I knew she loved the man and not the money. I told myself there would be a right moment. We got married in a small ceremony behind my grandmother's house, under the same maple tree I used to climb as a kid. My grandmother wore her good blue dress and cried through most of the vows. Ashley looked happier than I had ever seen her. I remember thinking, this is the moment I built all of it for, even though nobody in that yard except my accountant and my lawyer knew what all of it actually meant. I was 34 years old, married to a woman I loved, sitting on a fortune nobody could see, believing that the 2 most important things in my life, my quiet success and my quiet marriage, would simply take care of themselves as long as I kept working hard and kept my head down. I was wrong about that. But it would take 3 years for the crack to show, and almost 5 more before I understood how deep it had gone. The hairline crack. The first year of marriage was good, genuinely good, not the kind of good people perform for a camera. Ashley and I had a small house outside Columbus, modest by design, because I never wanted her to look around and start doing math on the mortgage. We cooked dinner together most nights. We took a trip to the Smoky Mountains for our first anniversary and got lost on a hiking trail for 3 hours and laughed about it the whole way back to the car. The cracks did not arrive as a single event. They arrived the way water gets into a foundation, slow and quiet, in places you cannot see until the damage is already done. It started with small comments. Ashley worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized firm downtown, and she would come home talking about clients who flew first class, executives who wore watches that cost more than our car. At first it was just conversation. Then it became a kind of measuring stick she held up against our life without saying so directly. One night, about 2 years in, she asked me why we still drove a 5-year-old Honda when I quote-unquote did fine in real estate. I told her the truth, which was that I did not believe in spending money to look successful, only in spending money on things that actually built something. She rolled her eyes and said that sounded like something my grandmother would say. She was right. It was. She started going out more with a group of coworkers, most of them younger, most of them single, most of them the kind of people who posted every dinner and every vacation online. I did not mind that she had friends. What I minded, though I did not say it clearly enough at the time, was the way she started coming home and comparing our life to a highlight reel that was not real to begin with. There were small cruelties too, the kind that are easy to miss if you are not paying attention, and impossible to unsee once you are. She stopped introducing me by name at her work events. She would say, "This is my husband," and move on to the next person before I could shake a hand. At a company holiday party, a coworker asked what I did, and Ashley answered for me before I could open my mouth. She said, "Oh, he does something with houses," in a tone that made it sound like a hobby instead of a career. She started correcting the way I dressed. Nothing dramatic, just a comment here and there. "That jacket is a little much for where we're going. Maybe wear the other shoes. These ones look old." I did not think much of it in the moment. My grandmother had taught me that a man's value has nothing to do with the label on his collar, so the comments rolled off me the way rain rolls off a good roof. What I did not notice, or did not want to notice, was that Ashley was not just commenting on my clothes. She was quietly deciding I embarrassed her. The distance grew in the bedroom too, though not in the way people usually mean. It was not about intimacy at first. It was about attention. She would be on her phone until midnight, texting friends, scrolling through photos of vacations we were not on and cars we did not own. I would ask about her day and get one-word answers. I would tell her about a property closing or a difficult contractor issue, and she would nod without really listening, the way you nod at a weather report. I remember one night specifically, about 3 years into the marriage, when she came home from a dinner with 2 coworkers and their partners. One of the partners worked in finance and had just bought a lake house. Ashley did not say much about it directly, but she was quiet the rest of the night. And when I asked if something was wrong, she said, "I just wonder sometimes if we are ever going to get ahead." I told her we were doing fine, that we had savings, that we had no debt, that we were building something steady. She said, "Steady is not the same as impressive, Daniel." I let that sentence sit there longer than I should have. I did not correct her. I did not tell her the truth about the 11 properties, the 2 commercial buildings downtown, the holding company that was quietly worth more than either of us had ever said out loud. I told myself I was protecting the marriage by keeping money out of it. Looking back, I think I was protecting myself from finding out what she actually valued. My grandmother noticed before I did. She always did. At a Sunday dinner around that time, she pulled me aside in the kitchen while Ashley was on the porch with her phone. She said, "Daniel, a woman who married the man you pretend to be will leave the moment she finds a man who is not pretending." I laughed it off then. I did not laugh at it later. By the 4th year, the small erosions had become a pattern I could not ignore, even if I wanted to. Ashley started working later. She started taking calls in the other room. She started talking more about a man from a different department at her firm. A man named Rick, who she said was funny, who she said understood ambition, who she said actually got what it meant to want more out of life. I did not think affair. Not yet. I thought distance. I thought maybe we had drifted the way people sometimes drift, and I told myself we would find our way back if I just worked a little less and paid a little more attention. I did not know yet that the crack in our marriage was about to meet the man who would try to break it open completely, and that the same quiet instincts my grandmother had spent a lifetime teaching me were about to become the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had built without anyone in that house ever knowing it existed. The rival enters Rick Callahan had the kind of confidence that fills a room before he says a single word. I met him for the first time at a company anniversary party for Ashley's firm, one of the rare events she actually wanted me at, though I understood later that this was less about wanting me there and more about wanting to see how I measured up against him in person. Rick was 38, tall, with the kind of tan that comes from actual vacations and not just genetics. He worked in business development at a real estate investment firm downtown, a firm that, as it happened, managed several commercial properties on behalf of larger ownership groups. He drove a black German sedan that he mentioned within 90 seconds of meeting me. He wore a watch that he made sure caught the light whenever he shook someone's hand. He shook my hand that night like he was doing me a favor. "So you are the husband," he said, looking me over, the way you look over a used car you already decided not to buy. "Ashley tells me you are in real estate too. Small world." I told him I dealt mostly in residential and some light commercial. He laughed, not unkindly at first, and said, "Residential is where everybody starts. I moved past that a long time ago." He said it the way a man says something he has said many times before, polished from repetition, meant to land exactly the way it landed. Ashley laughed at that comment. Not a big laugh, just enough of one that I felt it in my chest more than I wanted to admit. Over the following months, Rick became a name that showed up in nearly every conversation. Rick thought the new restaurant downtown was overrated. Rick was closing a huge deal. Rick took his team to a conference in Miami. Rick said something smart about the market that Ashley repeated to me at dinner like it was breaking news, when it was, in fact, something I had told her myself 2 years earlier, worded almost exactly the same way. I want to be honest about something here, because this story only works if I am. I did not hate Rick because he had money or confidence. I have known plenty of confident, wealthy people who earned every bit of respect they got. What bothered me about Rick was something else, something my grandmother had a name for. She called it the sound of an empty barrel. She used to say, "Empty barrels make the most noise, Daniel, and full ones just sit there quietly doing their job." Rick was loud in a way that made you assume there was substance behind the volume. It took me time, and a few careful questions asked in the right places, to learn there was less behind it than he wanted anyone to believe. The firm Rick worked for, the one Ashley increasingly seemed to admire from a distance, managed properties that included 2 buildings I was in the process of acquiring through my holding company, a transaction that had been in motion for almost a year and was still confidential at the executive level. Rick did not manage those properties directly. He was, from what I could tell through public records and a few discreet conversations with people in the industry, a mid-level business development employee who was good at talking about deals other people closed. I did not say any of this to Ashley, not yet. Partly because I did not have proof of anything beyond a professional hunch, and partly because some small, stubborn part of me wanted to see what she would do without any interference from me at all. The dinners with Rick became more frequent, always framed as work-related, always involving other co-workers at first, and then, gradually, not. Ashley started staying later at the office. She started taking her phone into the bathroom when it rang. She started deleting her call history, something I only noticed because I picked up her phone once to check the time and saw the screen was wiped clean in a way that looked less like tidiness and more like habit. The final piece that told me this had moved past professional admiration, came on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Ashley came home smelling faintly of a cologne that was not mine, wearing a blouse I did not recognize, with her hair styled in a way she usually reserved for events, not ordinary work days. She told me she had stayed late for a client dinner. I did not argue. I did not accuse her. I simply said okay, and made dinner, and watched her eat it while checking her phone under the table, thinking I could not see. My grandmother had one more line she used to say to me, one that came back to me clearly that night, as I lay awake next to a woman who felt, for the first time in our marriage, like a stranger sharing my bed. She used to say, "Never confront a storm while it is still forming, Daniel. Let it show you its whole shape first, and then decide how you will stand against it." That night I decided I would not confront anything yet. I would watch. I would gather. I would let Rick Callahan believe, for as long as it took, that he was circling a man with nothing behind him but a quiet job and a modest house. He had no idea what that quiet job actually was, and neither, still, did my own wife. The quiet record. I did not hire a private investigator in some dramatic, movie-style way. I am not that kind of man, and it is not how I have ever handled a problem. What I did was simpler, and in its own way, more thorough. I paid attention, the same way I had paid attention to vacant buildings and empty storefronts my entire adult life, and I let the evidence organize itself in front of me. The first thing I did was talk to my lawyer, a man named Walter Grimes who had handled every contract of my career since I was 23 years old. Walter was in his 60s, careful, and did not waste words. I did not tell him I suspected an affair. I told him I wanted a full review of my asset protection, my trusts, and my holding company structure, effective immediately, quietly, and without any changes visible to anyone outside his office. Walter did not ask why. He simply nodded and said, "Good instinct, Daniel," and got to work. Within 2 weeks, every property, every account, and every piece of the business I had spent nearly 2 decades building was restructured in a way that protected it completely, regardless of what happened in my marriage. This was not an act of cruelty toward Ashley. It was the same discipline I applied to every part of my professional life. Protect what you have built before you find out whether it needs protecting. The second thing I did was more personal and harder. I started keeping a record, not out of paranoia, but out of the same instinct that had made me successful in the first place, the instinct to document rather than assume. I noted dates. I noted the nights Ashley came home late. I noted the receipts that occasionally appeared in the laundry, restaurants I had never been to, a hotel bar downtown that had no reason to appear on a work expense unless the work in question was something other than work. I did not confront her with any of it, not yet. My grandmother had taught me that anger spends itself the moment it opens its mouth, and a wise man saves his voice for when it will actually matter. The third thing happened almost by accident, in the way that important things often do. In my professional life, my holding company had been in final negotiations to acquire majority ownership in a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm downtown, one that had run into liquidity trouble after a handful of bad deals and an over-leveraged expansion into properties it could not sustain. The firm was called Cresthaven Group. Cresthaven Group was the company Rick Callahan worked for. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters to the honesty of this story. I did not orchestrate this. I did not go looking for a way to control the company employing the man circling my marriage. The acquisition had been in motion for nearly a year before Rick Callahan's name ever entered my life, driven entirely by Cresthaven's financial position and my own company's long-term strategy to expand into commercial holdings. The timing was not my doing. It was simply the kind of coincidence that life occasionally hands you, the kind you either notice or let pass by unused. I noticed. I told Walter to keep the acquisition entirely confidential, not just from the public, but from Cresthaven employees at every level below the outgoing ownership group. Nobody at that company, including its own executive leadership, would know the new majority owner until the deal closed and I chose to make it known. This was not unusual for me. I had done the same thing with every acquisition in my career. I never wanted a building or a business to change the way it treated its people the moment a new owner walked in the door. I wanted to see the truth of a place before anyone had a reason to perform for me. That decision, made for entirely professional reasons, meant that for the 6 weeks leading up to what happened next, I sat in rooms with lawyers and accountants finalizing paperwork that would make me the majority owner of the very company Rick Callahan built his identity around, while going home each night to a wife who had started introducing that same man's name into conversations with a warmth she had stopped extending to me. I did not enjoy the irony. I want to say that clearly. There was no part of me that felt triumphant during those 6 weeks. I felt something closer to grief, the particular kind of grief that comes from watching something you built with your own hands slowly come apart while you are still holding the tools. My grandmother, who I visited every Sunday without fail, noticed the weight I was carrying before I said a word about it. She was 81 years old by then, sharper than most people half her age, and she had a way of reading me that no one else ever managed. She asked me directly one Sunday afternoon, over coffee at her kitchen table, whether Ashley was still the woman I married. I told her I did not know anymore. She reached across the table and took my hand, the same way she had when I was 8 years old and scared of something I could not name. She said, "Daniel, a man who builds quietly is often married by someone who never understood what quiet actually means. Some people mistake silence for emptiness. It is the saddest mistake a person can make, and it usually costs them everything." I asked her what I should do. She said, "Nothing yet. Let the truth finish revealing itself. A story that ends too early never teaches anyone anything, including you." I took her advice. I kept documenting. I kept working. I kept the acquisition moving forward in complete silence. And I waited, the same way I had waited on that first duplex 15 years earlier, knowing that patience was not weakness. It was the only tool that had ever actually worked. I did not know yet that the waiting was about to end, or that it would end in the most public way possible, at an event Ashley had been planning for months, an event she believed would be the moment she finally, publicly, stepped into the life she thought she deserved. The setup. The event was framed to me as an engagement dinner for one of Ashley's co-workers, a woman named Brianna, who I had met twice and did not know well. Ashley asked me to come, which struck me as strange given how distant she had become, but I said yes without hesitation. Looking back, I understand now that she needed me there for a reason that had nothing to do with Brianna at all. The dinner was held at a private event space downtown, the kind of venue with exposed brick and hanging string lights that photographs well for social media. About 40 people were invited, mostly people from Ashley's firm, a handful of spouses, and, as I learned once we arrived, several people from Cresthaven Group, including Rick. I want to slow down here, because the 6 weeks leading up to this dinner matter to what happened inside it. The Cresthaven acquisition had closed 11 days earlier. I was, as of that Tuesday, the majority owner of the company that employed Rick Callahan, a fact known at that point only to Walter, my accounting team, and the outgoing ownership group who had signed a standard confidentiality agreement as part of the sale. Rick did not know. Ashley did not know. Nobody in that room would know, not until the moment I chose to let them. I had also, in those same 6 weeks, finished reviewing every piece of documentation I had quietly gathered. The pattern was no longer ambiguous. Ashley and Rick had been seeing each other for at least 4 months, based on hotel receipts, message deletions, and a pattern of late nights that no longer had any reasonable business explanation behind them. I had not confronted her. I had decided, with Walter's counsel and my grandmother's wisdom sitting somewhere in the back of my mind, that I would not be the one to force the truth into the open. I would simply stop protecting anyone from it. Ashley had, without knowing it, been planning her own kind of reveal that night. I learned this only in pieces as the evening unfolded, but the shape of it became clear soon enough. She had decided, apparently with Rick's encouragement, that this dinner would be the night she told our shared circle of friends and co-workers that our marriage was ending. Not through a quiet conversation, not through a private admission to me first, through a public unveiling, in front of 40 people, with Rick standing beside her as the upgrade she believed she had earned. I did not know the specifics of her plan when I walked into that venue in a gray suit that Ashley had once called a little much for where we're going. I only knew, from the documents in Walter's office and the acquisition papers signed 11 days earlier, that I was walking into that room carrying a secret significantly larger than the one I suspected Ashley was hiding from me. Rick arrived 20 minutes after we did, wearing a navy suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who spend money to be looked at. He shook hands around the room with the easy confidence of someone who believed, correctly as it turned out, that most of the people in that room admired him. He made his way toward Ashley and me with a drink in hand and a look on his face that I did not fully understand until later. It was the look of a man who believed he was about to win something in front of an audience and wanted the audience assembled before he did it. Ashley squeezed my arm as we found our table, and for one brief, foolish moment, I let myself believe that maybe I had read the whole situation wrong, that maybe this would simply be a pleasant dinner and nothing more. My grandmother's voice found me anyway, the way it always did in moments I needed it most. She used to say, "Hope is a fine thing to carry, Daniel, as long as you never let it carry you instead." I did not let it carry me. I sat through the appetizers watching Rick work the room, watching him make a point of mentioning his firm, his position, his recent deals, each sentence aimed loosely in my direction, like a man testing the ground before a bigger move. I watched Ashley laugh at every one of his jokes, with a warmth I had not seen directed at me in over a year. Somewhere between the second course and the champagne toast for Brianna and her fiancé, I understood, with total clarity, that Ashley and Rick had planned something for that night, and that whatever it was, they intended it to happen in front of every single person in that room. I finished my water. I set my napkin down. And I waited, the same way I had waited my whole life, for the moment to arrive on its own. I did not have to wait long. The humiliation, the toast for Brianna wrapped up around 8:30, and the room shifted into that loose, wine-warmed rhythm that settles over dinners once the formal part is finished and people start moving between tables. That was when Rick stood up. He tapped his glass with a fork, the sound sharp enough to cut through the conversation, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone confident asks for their attention. Ashley sat beside me, very still, her hand no longer on my arm. Rick began by congratulating Brianna again, a short line that felt more like a formality than a purpose. Then he said he had one more announcement to make, one he had been waiting for the right room to share. He looked directly at me when he said it. He said that some people spend their whole lives standing still, mistaking comfort for ambition, and that real partners deserve real partners, people who match their hunger instead of dragging behind it. A few people laughed, the uncertain kind of laugh that happens when a joke has not fully landed yet, and the room is deciding whether it is allowed to. Then he reached for my glass of champagne, the one still sitting untouched in front of me, and held it up like an exhibit. He said, "I'm not marrying a man who can't even afford real champagne," gesturing at the modest label I had chosen, simply because I liked the taste of it, not because I was incapable of buying anything else in that building. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Ashley laughed loudest of all, a laugh I recognized instantly as the one she used to give me, years earlier. At private jokes only the two of us understood. Except this time it was aimed at me, in a room full of people, and it did not feel private at all. Ashley stood up next to Rick. She said, more to the room than to me, that she deserved a life that actually moved forward, a partner who understood ambition, instead of settling for safe. She said the word settling with a particular weight, the kind of weight that told me she had rehearsed it. She said she had been unhappy for a long time, that she had found someone who saw the woman she was capable of becoming, and that she was done pretending our marriage was something worth saving. She did not look at me while she said most of it. She looked at Rick, and she looked at the room, gauging the reaction the way a performer checks an audience mid-scene. I want to describe, specifically, what that moment felt like, because I think it matters to understand the full weight of it before the story turns. It was not just the words, it was the details around them. It was Brianna, whose engagement dinner this was supposed to be, quietly setting down her fork and looking anywhere but at our table. It was a co-worker, 2 seats down, murmuring something to her husband, not quite hiding her smile. It was the string lights overhead, warm and golden, lighting a scene that felt, in that moment, like the coldest room I had ever sat in. It was Rick setting my glass back down in front of me, with a small, deliberate click against the tablecloth, the sound of a man putting a period at the end of a sentence he believed he had won. Someone near the back of the room actually clapped, 2 or 3 claps, the kind that starts before anyone is sure it should, and then trails off into an awkward silence when nobody joins. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up quickly or knock over a chair the way people do in movies. I sat there for a moment, in the particular kind of stillness my grandmother used to call the eye of the man, not the storm, and I let the room finish laughing. Then I stood, slowly, buttoned my jacket, and looked at Rick with an expression I imagine he mistook for defeat. I said, very calmly, that I hoped he enjoyed his evening, and that I would see him Monday morning. He laughed again, louder this time, and said something about how he did not believe our paths crossed anywhere close to Monday morning, given that I did not exactly run in his circles. I did not correct him there. I let the room have its laugh. I let Ashley have her moment, standing beside the man she believed represented everything I could never give her. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, thanked Brianna quietly for the invitation, and walked out of that venue into the cold spring air alone, while behind me the room was still finishing its laughter at the man they believed had just lost everything. They had no idea what Monday morning actually was. The reveal Monday morning. Cresthaven Group held its quarterly all-staff meeting, a routine gathering held in the firm's largest conference room, the kind of meeting employees usually treated as background noise before returning to their desks. This particular meeting had been scheduled for weeks, long before the engagement dinner, long before any of what happened between Ashley and Rick had reached its public conclusion. The timing, again, was not something I engineered. It was simply the calendar doing what calendars do. What had changed, in the 11 days since the acquisition closed, was the agenda. I walked into that conference room at 9 in the morning sharp, wearing the same gray suit Ashley once called a little much. Walter walked in beside me, along with 2 members of my executive team who had handled the transition work. Rick was seated near the middle of the room, coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone the way people do in meetings they do not expect to matter. The outgoing CEO of Cresthaven Group, a man named Philip Andrade who had run the company for 11 years before selling his controlling stake, stood at the front of the room and asked for everyone's attention. He told the room that Cresthaven had undergone a significant ownership change over the past several weeks, one that had been kept confidential during final negotiations, and that he wanted to personally introduce the company's new majority owner. He said my name. I want to describe Rick's face in that moment as precisely as I can, because it is the moment this entire story turns on, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than dramatically. He did not immediately understand. For the first 3 or 4 seconds, he simply looked confused, the way anyone looks when a name they know from an entirely different context appears somewhere it does not belong. Then his eyes moved from Philip to me, standing at the front of the room in a suit he had mocked 5 days earlier, and something behind his expression began to shift, slowly, like a man watching a wall crack before he fully understands the building is coming down. I did not smile. I did not look at him with triumph. My grandmother had told me, more than once, that a man who gloats over a fallen rival has simply confirmed the rival was right to underestimate his character in the first place. I had no interest in confirming anything about myself that morning except the truth. I kept my remarks short. I introduced myself the way I introduce myself in every acquisition, focused entirely on the business. I told the room that Cresthaven Group had a strong foundation of talented people, that my intention was continuity and stability rather than dramatic upheaval, and that I looked forward to working alongside the existing team to strengthen the firm's position in the market. I did not mention Ashley. I did not mention the dinner. I did not mention Rick by name at all. I did not need to. The room did that work for me. I watched, in the following days, as the story moved through Cresthaven Group the way stories always move through offices. Quietly at first, and then all at once. Someone had been at the engagement dinner, or knew someone who had, and the details found their way back to the very building where Rick now had to sit across a conference table from the man he had mocked over a glass of modest champagne 5 days earlier. I did not orchestrate any of that spread. I did not need to. Human nature did the work. The actual unraveling of Rick's position, though, did not come from gossip. It came from Walter, 3 weeks later, in a conversation that had nothing to do with the dinner and everything to do with ordinary due diligence. During the standard financial review that follows any acquisition, Walter's team uncovered irregularities in a set of expense reports tied to Rick's department, patterns of inflated client entertainment costs, and a business development budget that did not match the deals it claimed to be supporting. Walter brought the findings to me not as ammunition, but simply as part of his job. He said, "Daniel, I think you need to see this," in the same even tone he used for every piece of business, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware and too professional to comment on, the personal weight the name attached to those files carried for me. I did not touch the investigation myself. I asked Walter and the head of internal compliance to handle it exactly as they would handle any other employee under similar circumstances, with full documentation, full fairness, and no shortcuts in either direction. I did not want Rick's downfall to come from me. I wanted it to come from the truth, the same way mine had almost come apart from a truth I had kept hidden too long. The aftermath. The internal review into Rick's expense reports took just under 6 weeks to complete. I want to be precise about what happened, because the truth was serious enough without needing exaggeration. The compliance team found a pattern of falsified client entertainment expenses stretching back nearly 2 years, totaling a little over $90,000 in reimbursements, tied to dinners, trips, and entertainment, that either never occurred or were billed at inflated amounts far beyond what actually took place. Some of those expenses, the investigation found, corresponded suspiciously well with dates I recognized from my own quiet documentation months earlier. Dinners and hotel visits that had nothing to do with clients at all. Cresthaven Group terminated the employment of Rick Callahan for cause. Given the scale of the falsified expenses, the matter was referred to legal counsel for potential recovery of funds, a process that was still unfolding the last I heard anything about it. I did not push for that outcome. I did not need to. I simply declined to intervene on his behalf, which, given what the documentation showed, was not a hard decision to reach. Word of his termination moved through the local business community quickly, the way these things do in a mid-sized city where everyone in commercial real estate eventually crosses paths. Two firms that had reportedly shown interest in hiring him quietly withdrew their conversations once the details became known. I did not make a single phone call to make that happen. I did not need to. Reputation, once it cracks, tends to finish breaking on its own. Ashley and I finalized our divorce a little over 4 months after the engagement dinner. I want to be honest about that period, because it was not clean or easy or cinematic. There was no scene where she showed up at my door in tears asking for forgiveness. No dramatic confrontation where she admitted everything with the same audience present that had watched her humiliate me. It was mostly paperwork, mediated through lawyers, conducted with the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of something that has already been over for longer than either person wanted to admit. Because of the asset protections Walter had put in place months before any of this became public, the divorce settlement was straightforward. Ashley had no claim to the holding company, the properties acquired before our marriage, or the Cresthaven acquisition, none of which had ever been commingled with shared marital assets. She received a fair settlement based on the assets that were, in fact, shared, our house and the modest joint accounts we had built together. I did not fight her on any of it. My grandmother had taught me that a man who wins a divorce through cruelty has not actually won anything worth having. I saw Ashley once more after the paperwork was finalized, by accident, at a grocery store near our old neighborhood. She looked tired in a way I had not seen on her before, the particular tiredness of someone who has spent a long time chasing something that turned out to be smaller than it looked from a distance. She did not bring up Rick. She did not bring up the dinner. She asked, quietly, whether I was doing all right, and I told her, honestly, that I was. I did not gloat. I did not remind her of the champagne comment, or the laughter, or the 6 weeks I had spent carrying a secret so much larger than the one she thought she was hiding from me. There was nothing left to prove. The truth had already done everything it needed to do. In that conference room, in that compliance report, in the quiet unraveling of a life Rick had built on borrowed confidence and false expenses. My grandmother, when I told her the whole story finally start to finish, sitting at her kitchen table the way we always did on Sundays, did not celebrate either. She simply nodded slowly and said, "The loudest people in a room are usually compensating for something they know is missing. Daniel, you never had to raise your voice, because you were never missing anything to begin with." I sat with that for a long time after she said it. What came after it has been a little over 2 years since that engagement dinner. Cresthaven Group is stable now, profitable, and quietly one of the stronger commercial real estate firms in the region, run day to day by a management team I trust completely, with me involved but never at the center of attention, the same way I have run every part of my business for 2 decades. I still live modestly. I still drive a car that is a few years old. I still buy the champagne I actually like, instead of the champagne that photographs well. My grandmother, 83 now, and sharper than most people, a third her age, still tells me every single Sunday that the quietest man in the room is usually the one who owns it, and I still believe her more completely than I believe almost anything else in this life. About a year after the divorce, I met a woman named Claire, introduced through a mutual friend at, of all places, a property renovation Claire was overseeing for a local nonprofit that restores housing for veterans. She did not know who I was beyond the modest introduction our friend gave her. She asked good questions. She did not ask what I drove or where I vacationed. She asked why I cared about the veterans housing project, and she listened to the answer the way people listen when they are actually interested in what you are saying, not simply waiting for their turn to speak. I told her the truth about myself within our first month of dating, all of it. The properties, the holding company, the full shape of what I had spent 20 years building. I did not wait 3 years this time. I did not need to test her the way I once felt I needed to test Ashley, because I understood, finally, that the testing itself had been part of the problem. A marriage built on withheld truth is not a foundation. It is a hairline crack waiting for enough pressure to find it. Claire and I have been together for a little over a year now. We are in no hurry, and for the first time in my adult life, that feels like a strength instead of a delay. If you have ever sat in a room and let people underestimate you, comment below and tell me what that felt like, because I know I am not the only one who has lived it. And if you have ever been the one doing the underestimating, I hope this story finds you before the room does it for you. I do not think about Rick often anymore. I do not think about that champagne glass, or the laughter, or the particular sound it made when he set it back down on the tablecloth. What I think about, instead, is my grandmother's kitchen table and the quiet certainty in her voice every single Sunday of my life, telling me that the people who build the most rarely need to announce it, because the truth, given enough time, always finds its own way into the room. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more, because there are quieter victories out there worth telling, and I plan on telling every one of them. I did not need Rick to lose everything to know what I had built. I already knew. I had known it the whole time, standing quietly in a room full of people who assumed silence meant I had nothing to say. They were wrong. They were simply the last ones to find out.